So good evening again. My name, as always, is Steve Tinney, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Penn Museum. Many thanks to all of you for coming to tonight's installment of our annual Greats Lectures. This year, of course, our theme is Great Stuff, something we have a lot of in the museum. And we're looking at a whole range of aspects of the topic, including next time, when Simon Martin, Associate Curator and Keeper in the American section, will talk about transcendental stuff on June the 5th in a lecture entitled The Stuff Beyond, the Great Maya Cosmos. We've actually shifted the speakers from next time and this time. Tukufu was supposed to go last. I'm not sure whose idea it was, but it's almost as though this was Simon's idea so that his lecture on the Stuff Beyond was last in the series. For those of you who can't make it next time but really wanted to hear Simon, a quick reminder that all of the lectures do appear on the museum's YouTube channel and from several past years as well. So there's hours and hours of stuff to watch on your Chromecast if you're so inclined. So as usual, after the lecture, there'll be time for questions, which will be moderated by our speaker. And there'll be a microphone going around so everyone can hear the questions as well as the answers. And so to our speaker. Dr. Tukufu Zuberi is Lassery Family Professor of Race Relations and Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his many publications are the books Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, The Mortality Cost of Colonizing Liberia in the 19th Century, Thicker Than Blood, How Racial Statistics Lie, and African Independence, How Africa Shapes the World. This last accompanying the film also entitled African Independence, which is an award-winning feature-length documentary that highlights the birth, realization, and problems confronted by the movement to win independence in Africa. Elsewhere in his media career, many of you may well have seen Tukufu in his role as host of the PBS show, History Detectives. Tukufu is also an experienced curator of exhibitions. He has curated Tides of Freedom, African Presence on the Delaware River, which I believe is still up at the Independence Seaport Museum, as well as Black Bodies in Propaganda, the Art of the War poster, which some of you may have seen here at the Penn Museum, which has also been traveling around the country. More recently, but still here in our museum, Tukufu has been putting his energies and expertise into the reinstallation of the new Africa galleries, on which he is lead curator. These galleries open this coming November 16th, so mark your calendars. This major new reinstallation will present our collections as never before, acknowledging their colonial collecting history and embedding them in new narratives. So with all of this, I think you can see why Tukufu Zuberi is the perfect person to talk to us on this evening on his topic, Whose Stuff Is It Anyway? Decolonization and the Role of Museums in Contemporary Society. Tukufu.
How y'all doing tonight? You know, if you would have asked me 20 years ago if I was going to be involved in curating the redesign of the Africa galleries, I would have told you, well, maybe I will advise the cat or the woman what they need to do, but there's no way that I will be doing it. But somehow my life has always led me through twists and changes. I said the same thing about being on PBS. I was like, I don't have time to be on PBS. I do important things. And then, you know, about 12 to 13 years later, I recognized that sometimes you have to change your perspective about what you do and how you do it. And that is very appropriate for the conversation I'd like to have with you tonight. I'd like to talk to you about the need to change our perspectives about the things we encounter in museums. You know, in part, I want to say why I think museums are so important. I feel I need to say that. and then I need to talk about how we need to have some change. And I want to suggest to you my motivations for this change. I'm going to use a lot of words in the beginning and to kind of give you the set and try to intellectually set it up for you. And then I will show you some images in which hopefully it will make my point more clear. So this is a thing that I think we ought to get out of the way first. Is there, between the 16th and the 19th century, there was a tremendous transformation on planet Earth. And that was this great migration out of Europe to many places in the world. And in many of these places were created kind of neo-Europes, like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and places like that. Other places there was the creation of colonies. And these colonies were kind of ruled from either these, the European base in which they were in, or from, some of these neo-Europes, as you will. What I'm trying to show you here is the migration out of Africa, my green lines, and the out of Europe being my white lines. It's not comprehensive. It's simply a graphic display for me to say that the world changed during this period of time. And as it changed, many people were put in very subordinate positions. They were marginalized as groups of people who almost by their definition, they were marginalized. If it was the Native American population in the United States, their position and their place in this space was marginalized. But it's very important to remember they were here. They did stuff here. Their marginalization and somehow kind of being written out of history in many ways is a consequence of this process that you see. It was not a very benign process of discovery. It was a process of establishing a new way of people in the world interacting with each other. There's a thing called the Columbian Exchange. Even if you Google it, it'll come up and it'll talk about this great movement and the exchange that it motivated. And in that motivated exchange, there was in the West new food, new information, new resources, and new potentials and possibilities. Now, the colonial logic of thinking of this, that is, if we think of how we think about it, it would suggest that the human population reached 1 billion around 1800, okay? And that this was in large part, because of this Columbian Exchange, which spread civilization between this period of time that I'm talking about. And that's a kind of thing to keep in mind. Because, in some ways, from another perspective, we need to consider the possibility that it was a Columbian devastation, especially for those Native Americans who were in place or those Africans who were being transported to this place, and similar experiences for similar people in different places. But then reaching this 1 billion population somehow now becomes contingent on the sacrifices of the indigenous populations in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and some islands through kind of the barbaric practices of colonialism. And so in some ways, these practices get hidden behind what I'm suggesting to you is a colonial mentality, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And the problem with this colonial mentality is that it leads us to not see the Native Americans who were here and to not realize the contributions of the Africans who were transported in this process. Other groups got affected by it equally, but that's two that I want to talk about as I try to discuss, this stuff we have here in the museum and how we present this stuff and what this stuff can do for us. Now, museums in the West developed in response to the needs of an imperial and colonial mentality. They were not created in the beginning as places that you could go and receive education. They started as in people's homes and in people's rooms, and they would have cabinets of curiosity and things of this nature that they would invite friends over to see. People would collect things if they were part of the colonial trade, and they would pick up things in the Americas and Africa, and they would arrange them in their houses as ways to discuss both the geography of the world, the cultural differences of the world, or the potential opportunities for trade and other forms of economic exchange. Now, in some ways, I want to say that this colonial mentality needed to, and it continues to need to, in unfortunately many places, to justify the racial divisions of the world without reference to the processes that produce the differences. So it's very important in those conversations to almost not talk about colonialism. It's almost not a discussion of enslavement. And so you don't really get a sense or a feel for the reasons that the interest in these objects is there. Why create a room with cabinets of curiosity? Why let that grow into the Victoria and Albert Museum? Why would these things happen? And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about. Now, we understand that the surrendering of these populations in Africa and Asia and America and some of the islands was a kind of offering to the deity of modern capitalism. It's on their backs that we base modern society. And museums in the West paid tribute to justifying this slaughter in the past and the present, and did it with a colonial mentality. That is, you could almost do it by writing the people out of it. Many people would talk about the Columbian Exchange in this way. They would say, we looked at the Americas and there was nobody there. But there was lots of food and lots of stuff and lots of gold, and we could bring that back to Europe, and it fueled population growth and development in Europe, right? But somehow the Native American population got talked out of that. I want to try to talk back in these indigenous populations. I want to use Africa as the case of how to talk them back in, and why it is necessary to talk them back into the conversation if we will enhance our ability to learn from these material. And I do think it's important to learn from these material. They may have been collected in very different and very troubling ways, but it still remains that we have the task of learning from them. Or maybe that's just me as a professor who always thinks we should learn from anything. Or maybe it's me as a parent who says you can even learn from the bad stuff you do, so keep on going, son or daughter. So these objects of material culture in the Penn Museum, which is one of the most outstanding collections of African material culture in the world, they provide another level of the African diaspora. That's if we would think of the African diaspora to include people and objects, and these objects being outside of Africa, being part of its material cultures diaspora, if you will. Now, the first museums in the West began to take shape at the same time as this colonial devastation was consolidating a new world order. The French Empire was becoming. The British Empire was becoming. The Portuguese Empire, to a lesser degree, but a significant degree, was becoming. The Dutch Empire was becoming. So these great empires were being created, as were the first museums to display the world in the center of the empire. And that's why these great museums of the world are located in those places, and the United States by its affiliation. In this New World Order, people became differentiated between the free and the enslaved, the colonized and the colonizers, the civilized and the barbarians, and were spoken of in such ways and labeled with great consequence with these labels. So museums advanced national narratives of identity and class, which helped place people in their specific or particular place. It's very interesting to me that this happened, and it's very interesting to me how it continues to grow as an important space to help people, children, up until the oldest who can visit the museum. It continues to serve, I think, a very important place for public education. So museums kind of advance a national narrative of the identity. Where do we fit relative to the other places in the world? Where do we stand relative to the history of civilization? Now, the world has changed a lot. And I think now we can use this same material culture, which was used at one point to justify how Africa was a savage place, how Africa was a place in need of colonialism, in need of enslavement, and these things. Then we can tell a different kind of story that's not guided by that need to justify colonialism or to justify enslavement, which are antiquated kind of conversations in the first place. So we have an opportunity to decolonize the exhibition of African material culture in the West. I'm not going to talk a lot about the specifics of what we're doing here at Penn, but I am going to talk about it. You'll see how it serves as the background to everything I say, because it's the laboratory, if you will, that I'm practicing in trying to do this. Now, during the formative years, the Penn Museum Africa galleries were curated in ignorance or denial of the great social transformations occurring on the African continent. I mean, there were significant movements of PanAfricanism in the Anglophone colonies, and my idea of PanAfricanism is to be inclusive, not only of the Pan-African defined movement, but all those movements for independence. It's the same with Negritude and the same with Pan-Arabism. These movements were changing what it meant to be an African, and they were changing the relationship of Africans to the colonies and to the former colonial mentalities which had dominated their perspectives on Africa as well. So the people of Africa had been dispersed involuntarily to the corners of the earth, and this dispersal included African material culture. But I think it's a mistake often to separate people from their culture and to separate material culture from the history of the material culture. There are people on both sides of that material culture. If you create a thing, there are people who use it, and there are people who create it, there are people who think about it, and people who design it. And we need to be cognizant of all those people's involvement in it. In other words, you'll get things like people thinking that the Benin sculptures were made by people in Asia or people in India or people in China, which they did for a very long time until people began to challenge that. It was shocking for people to see the beauty and the fluidity in the artwork coming from Benin, so much so that it began to disrupt what people had written as the history of Western art. and what people had written about the history of African art. So in some ways, an object is fetishized. I won't dwell on this too long, but if you want, we can talk about it a little bit more. But object fetishism, as I'm talking about it here, kind of refers to this perception of social relationships involved in the transformation of material culture out of Africa, not as relationships among people, but as cultural relationships among the material culture in historical trade and preservation. And so what I'm trying to say is that often is difficult to imagine the Africa that you can actually see by looking at the particular item. But to do that, you have to not have your own fancy, but you do have to deal with what is actually taking place. So if an object is being moved from Africa to another place, it's going to move within a certain context. And we must ask, what is that context? If that context is a context of marginalizing the African continent by colonizing it and enslaving its people, then there is a certain level of fragmentation that is going to happen with that population. So the politics of this kind of objects of fetishism explains why most museums in the West separate sub-Saharan Africa from North Africa and North Africa from Egypt. And those kind of fragmentations can go on and on. But they mainly have to do with the geopolitics of what's going on in the West rather than the objects, rather than the material culture of Africa itself. So, in the Old Penn Museum, the Africa Galleries, visitors were invited to see objects from our world-renowned collection of over 60,000 works. In the past, we used a European Cabinets of Curiosity strategy advanced by the Horniman Museum, the British Museum, and the Louvre in Paris in how they treated African objects. I went to the Horniman Museum a few months ago, and I took this picture of this quote that's on the wall there, which I thought was very telling in itself. And I'll read it for you. The Horniman Free Museum can in very truth be termed a veritable cabinet of curiosity. From the moment one enters, interest is aroused, and it goes on increasing until the very last of the valuable collection has been seen. And in this context, the objects were thought to have a voice in themselves, and all you needed to do to understand the context of the object is to see the object. And so cabinets like this were full of things which, without a conversation about their relationship to each other, without a conversation about their passage through time and place to end up in the Horniman Museum. This is in the Horniman Museum. If you've been there, then you know as soon as you enter the bottom floor, it's right there in front of you, right? And I mean, our strategies have tended to be the same. This is the galleries. It's gone now, so maybe this picture is worth something, I don't know, but and all the walls have been chammed out and all the cases taken out. It's a wonderful, majestic process of recreation that's going on. But here too, much of the organizing theme was around form and shape, and not a lot of attention given to a narrative that would allow the visitor to understand where the material came from or how it came from there. And we did another project in the galleries to try to solicit information from the community, from the public, about what we should be doing about Africa. And so this was a very interactive organization of parts of the gallery so that it kind of allowed people to say things. We used all this material in our redesign of the galleries, which I thought was a lot of fun to do, is to contemplate what people were asking about. But one of the things they asked about was the impact of colonialism and the impact of enslavement on what they were looking at, because they couldn't gather that by just looking at the wonderful pieces of material culture. They had to try to put it in a situation. And their situation, unfortunately, was what you get through public education now, whether it's on television or going through schools, which was not very informative in terms of the African continent. It's another image. So I want to give you an example of changing ideas, emancipating African material culture from the colonial mentality. Okay, I just wrote that sentence, but I thought it was cool because I could use emancipating and colonialism kind of in juxtaposing them to each other. And we think of decolonization, but we forget that decolonization needs to have a positive component to it. That is not enough to decolonize. The big question has to be, what are you going to put in the place of colonialism? It's always been a problem in Africa where as soon as colonialism was happening, people were developing the idea of neo-colonialism and developing the idea of African pessimism and all kinds of other very interesting ideas which did not lead to something else existing on the African continent. The possibility of that has gone to be called something like other forms of African positivism. Now, when the Benin expedition, the punitive expedition by the British military occurred in 1897, they took a force of about 1,200 soldiers under Admiral Sir Harry Wollaston in response to Benin's refusal to become a British colony. Now, there's a lot of ways that people say they express this desire not to be a part of the British Empire. Some of it was in war, some of it was by disrespecting the British officers, and some of it was by just increasing the size of their own empire as a strategy to fight against this increasing colonial presence in Africa. And this is showing the Oba after he is captured by the British soldiers. Now, the royal palace is looted, and on September 9th, 1897, the Oba is imprisoned by the United Kingdom in an area far from his empire than in Calabar. But I always find this juxtapositioning of these images very telling to understand and appreciate the Benin objects, because the soldiers are sitting with the booty that they're collecting and preparing to take back and sell all over Europe. And up until this point, all of this work, all of these works, you can find them in many museums, even the ones up front. If you pay close attention, you can go find them in the British Museum or in the German museums or in Belgian museums or in the museum at the University of Pennsylvania. But they're stacked high. But he's in chains. I don't know if you could see. Can you see his little chain there on his leg? You know, I mean, they dressed him up, but they didn't cover the chain all the way up. I always wonder, is that intentional? I mean, there's several of these images, and always it looks like they almost covered the chain up. It just left a little bit for us to see. Anyway, it's consistent with my story. Part of it is transforming the meaning of the Oba, also transforming his connection to these things, because he has a direct connection to these things. So if you imprison him and you take these things, that's one thing. Now, in 1891, a photographer took this photo of an Oba shrine, and this would have been in the palace. And you see here these sculptures, these heads of Obas, and coming out of them is a large elephant tusk, very beautifully decorated. This shrine was to the Oba, and it was to contain one of these sculptures would be of his father. So the idea here is that in his palace exists this shrine as a tribute to his lineage and his space in Benin and his place in Benin society. Now, the pillage of the palace means that this shrine is destroyed. And as you can see, the piles of treasures coming from the palace are being transformed into booty for the military. Now, the Palace of the Oba, this is another image of the Palace of the Oba, and this is another, this image is taken in 1973 by one of the professors at the University of Pennsylvania who was working there. But you can see the material here. It's the same picture, same image, but different objects and a different shrine than the one, or a different altar than the one that we looked at before. And here on the other side is a preparation for an exhibition that's going to be held here at the University of Pennsylvania. And this exhibition had much more than the Benin material included in it. However, I'm just trying the juxtaposition of the two images, one being a shrine, the other being preparing for an exhibition. And so here another example of this. Here's a shrine again from 1891. That's the photo of the shrine. And on the other side is a catalog, or handbook of Africa and the South Seas, where you can see a very similar head of the Oba there. Can you all see what I'm talking about? You see this? You see that's right here? Now, this is very different here, right? Because there's no Oba here, and there's no way you can recreate this Oba's, there's no way to recreate this Oba's altar in this space. It would be a travesty, even if we did do it exactly like that, to think that it had the same significance. It could not have the same significance because the process of transformation, this transformation relocated the object, changed what it meant, and changed in whose possession it was in. So the question is, whose object is that? Is it now this object that we look at? Is it the same object that was in the palace? And it might be the same object, but does it have the same significance? So here's another example of our main message. This is a beautiful oval box from the Benin Kingdom. It was made by one of the guilds, the carving guild among the Benin. And you will see the Portuguese and a coiled pangolin, and they tell a story and offer a warning to the Oba. One of the ways we think this is what it's saying, because most of this is after the artist did it and without really access to him or the Oba to talk about its meaning. But later on, people within that cultural setting talk about it like this. The two Portuguese are fighting, as you can see. They're up here. Y'all see what I'm talking about right here? You see these guys? They're in a fight to the death, it looks like. They got blades out, they got hands on necks, heads are back, somebody's getting ready to die. So part of this was that even if your enemies are fighting, doesn't mean you will go free. So the pangolin here it's to represent the Oba, because his clothing was in this style, the shells, that's how the clothing that he wore was. But you'll notice that the legs are tied. So the message is your enemies may be fighting and they can still capture you. And based on an observation of what was happening in Africa at this time, it's quite astute to say that. And it's definitely a good thing to say to an Oba who may be getting a little big-headed because of a few battles that they won. And definitely the Benin Kingdom won several battles against the British attempting to colonize them. To me, the process of integrating this beautiful piece into the museum, and somehow you get the labeling of it. It gets a number, and that number doesn't represent this story, nor does that number represent this story being told to the Oba. The number represents our system of cataloging the objects into the Penn Museum, into this space. So in some ways, the transformation of the thing, the object from there to here, also requires a labeling of the thing, a naming of the thing. There are two of these boxes, these ivory boxes, that are two complete forms of these ivory boxes. The other one is at the National Museum in Scotland, and the one that we have that will be part of the new redesigned galleries. And he was, the artist who did this was in the process of constructing a third box, but was interrupted by the British invasion. And that box is in the National Museum in Nigeria. Now, here's some questions I think we could ask on the way to decolonization as we're making our way down that intellectual road. Some questions that we should ask. We should follow the people and the objects' journey from their creation in Africa to the museum in the West. Provenance is a good way to uncover a lot of the story and to be able to articulate why something is being shown to you at a certain moment. So if we answer these basic questions, I think we will have been doing a good job in the direction of resolving the idea of the colonization and why it exists. What is the object? What is it? Why was it made? Who was it made for? Who made it? Where did it come from? How did it come to be in a museum in the West? And in the background of this image is just to highlight this process. This is a letter that was written to the Penn Museum a year after the British punitive expedition. And it's written because one of the surgeons who was on the expedition had access to some materials. And the museum acquired several of these materials, one of which is this beautiful bracelet, which was constructed for probably a noble chief or a leader in the Benin Empire at that time. But the relationship of this bracelet to this letter is very important because we have in this particular place a very clear line of provenance of the piece. But we also have a very clear sense that for this surgeon, the piece was something to be sold. It was an object to be sold. For the person who had this, it was not an object to be sold. They had to have special permission from the Oba to wear a piece of ivory because the ivory was the monopoly of the Oba. He had to have his permission to send the ivory to the guild that would work the ivory to make it there. So again, the question of the relationship of this, if we were to decolonize our idea about the beauty of this and about the substance of this and what it means here and there, is to understand the narrative of how it got from there to here. And that narrative is a bloody narrative. So the decolonizing of exhibitions of Africa in the West require, I think, probably at a minimum, the consideration of the relevance of the curators, the artists, in understanding of their surrounding and the creators and the artists in understanding of their surroundings and their culture. And that's important because that is the context in which the thing was created. And the thing doesn't have the same meaning if you simply move it, nor do you undo the provenance of the item by moving it to another place. so that the transportation and display of these objects often obscure the true meaning of African material culture. And kind of challenging this, what I'm calling white logic or colonial logic of the Western colonial mentality and its attendant aesthetic paradigm, removes this from just a consideration that it's beautiful because it looks like something Picasso could have used in his recreation of this African form of art. So we need to push back against the obscuring of the relationship between the museums in the West and the enslaved and colonizers who created, who are the creators and the inventors of this African material culture. I would suggest we need to see in each object of material culture the designer, the maker, and the user, and the place. This situates us to be in a better space to decolonize how we talk about these things. I think there are challenges to emancipate and decolonize this conversation. And we have to ask, do we really possess the language and the appropriate terminologies for grasping the aesthetic vision of the items presented in the galleries of the West? Do we contain the right state of perspective to see the objects for what they are and what they can offer us? Can we produce the kind of shift that is necessary for the cultural fluency, for understanding and interpreting Africa in a non-marginalized way? Can we undo all the stereotypes that have been fed to us from day one to now? And that's in most places in the world from my experience when it comes to Africa. Can African artifacts, items be properly understood within the current theoretical constructs of our modern discussions about Africa? What does it mean to consider that much of the valuable material culture of Africa is outside of Africa? Part of that consideration must confront the reality that the reason that this situation exists is because of the colonization of Africa, is because of the legacy of enslavement. But it would be a brilliant thing if we could see these objects for what they are, things created by people, and things taken out of their original context and put into another context and used in this other contexts for different purposes. Sometimes for education, sometimes for entertainment. But what we must at least consider is what are the potential impacts of having this material culture in front of us and not changing that perspective. So the big uproar about where things should be has to be put in a context which recognizes Africa's material culture has become global because Africans themselves became global, often not by their choice, but by their interaction with the rest of the world. Thank you very much for your attention. So I think I'm here to take any questions if you have any, but if I've been crystal clear, I can understand that too.
What about repatriating the objects to their country of origins? This is definitely a movement among Native American artifacts, Egyptian artifacts, etc.
And that's progress, okay? And now and I'm saying that's progress because that is a shift from just looking at the objects and seeing them. Now people are raising questions about the provenance of those objects and about the significance of simply displaying an object, which often has a sacred cultural meaning, into a non-sacred space. Now, I think everybody would agree that cultural exchange is very important today. However, most of these African items did not arrive because of the mission of cultural exchange. And they were not collected with a mentality of the desire to have cultural exchange. And if you make a trip to any country in Africa, you may find a couple of museums of Europe, but they won't have the treasures of Europe. And there is no way you will ever be able to say, well, maybe, I don't know what the future holds, but I don't think you're going to be able to say that all the 70%, 80%, 90% of the treasures of France and Britain can be found in Senegal or Ghana. And to think of the idea is kind of startles the reality of the speaker. So that's a good thing. This conversation is good, but the conversation needs to grow in itself. And I think that this is a reflection of a growing consideration about African material culture. Yes, ma'am.
I'll ask a question that'll show my lack of depth.
Mm-hmm.
If I go to the museum, I'll go see a Roman piece, we'll say it's made at a certain time.
Right.
And I'll appreciate the skill of the maker. And if I've been in the African area, I might see a beautiful bowl that'll be labeled made at a certain time, and I'll appreciate the skill of the individual that did it. And if I'm understanding what you're saying is, part of the objection is that the item in the African area may just have been taken with the idea that someone had a right to do so. And my next question would be, I know you're involved in this new exhibit. To the extent that you can, if the information is available, how would you label that bowl differently to convey to me what obviously I shouldn't be learning?
So, and I'm not giving you the way that we're displaying this. That would have been nice. Where were you when I was writing this thing? So let me say this. So if you go and you see an item and it has a date and you recognize the beauty of it, that's something you can do. Of course, we've done that. Many of us have done that. But I think the question being raised is, what is the beauty of this item and why is it sitting in front of you right now? Why is this particular bowl in front of you? And why do you think it's beautiful? And, so it's the ability to have a conversation about that. So here is one example. So what we will do is this letter from 1898, a year after the punitive expedition, will be part of the display in which this bracelet, which is mentioned in this letter, is part of, okay? Can you see that one part? So what you will have here is you have the ability to see the beauty of this armlet, as they're called. But you also now have the ability to have an appreciation for why it's in front of you. And it just so happens, not all of the items in the Penn Museum collection were a result of punitive expeditions. Some of them were purchased in legitimate ways. Some were even purchased or acquired with the direct intent to put them in the museum with the consent of the people who were putting them in the museum. However, that would be important to know, right? Wouldn't that be an important kind of distinction to be able to make in your conversation about the material culture and have a better sense of the depth of appreciating that beauty is by putting it within some context. Because, in reality, beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder, it's also in the context of the beholder as well. Yes, sir.
Because of the combination of violence and disease, for instance, something like 90% of the Native American population was wiped out by the white man's disease when they came.
Right.
Are you going to do anything about trying to give us a sense of what the past structure was? Because if you say something's from Peru, then the people who live in Peru now might not have much to do with it because it was Incas or some other population. And the same with Africa. People have mingled and moved, and we might have funny ideas about what these terms mean versus what they meant when you collected the object.
Exactly. Let me give this. Let's follow the Africa example, right? So in the Africa example, the Benin Kingdom exists as a state, as a political area in Nigeria today. It does not exist as the Benin Kingdom of the past, which was a vastly larger place than the particular state that is represented by Benin today. The Benin culture, the representation of this material culture, is not only to be found in that place in Benin, but you could also find it in other places. Dahomey, or the current state of Benin, was at one point part of the Benin Empire. So they have that connection, right? So now that's gone. And here we are 100 or more years away. Does that change the narrative of the piece? No, it doesn't. It may change the question of how the conversation about reparation or repatriation of the items might take place, but that is a conversation that is taking place. So to get the cues and the balances correct on that is going to take a conversation. The important thing is that now the African voice is being raised in this conversation. And now the consideration from the African perspective is being made. Definitely one can say, 99% of ownership is possession. But then there is, that other 1%, which might have something to do with social justice or, people having access to a more just world or something like that. But that 1% becomes even more important at this moment because the consciousness on the African continent has increased and our consciousness has increased and changed as well. That's why we are talking about this issue. So how it gets reconfigured is a good question, but it is a question that we must consider in terms of changing our own idea about how we thought of collecting these items as part of the colonial mission of the states in which the items were brought. Definitely the soldiers at the punitive expedition in Britain were not knowledgeable about Benin history or culture. They were aware of it, but they were not knowledgeable about it. And the first exhibitions of these material did not reflect a keen understanding of the items, the material culture, the objects, where they came from, the people, the values they had, and even, the question of taking something that's sacred and putting it someplace else, you may not believe in the sacredness, and you may pray every night that it's not sacred, like they say. But the very fact that someone moves an item that is supposed to be sacred to another venue for people to come and simply look at it is in itself a kind of challenge of our own humanity. How can you do that? Why would you do that, right? And so that's why I was saying, put those questions in the process so if you see the beauty in it, you can also appreciate the context of that beauty. These other questions have to be worked out because people are not silent on it anymore. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You made a very good point about understanding the context of a physical object being created, being acquired, being transported, etc. To bring it, I would be very interested in your opinion. In recent years, there's been a great deal of discussion about the Civil War monuments, and these monuments are extremely offensive to some people and cultures and race in our society. But is your opinion again? Is this if they're interpreted and if the context is understood? Is this a teaching and learning moment, or is it so offensive that these should be done away with?
Well, there was a movement to build these monuments. I'm assuming you know that, by the Daughters of the Confederacy. The idea of putting these monuments in the places that they were had a significance. That is, people didn't just say, let's just build a Robert E. Lee statue and put it here. They had the idea of making a certain statement about what occurred in the U.S. Civil War. Now, I do appreciate that there are people who would suggest that the Confederate soldiers didn't lose the war, or that what they did was just not too bad. It was just, very fine people doing something. And I do recognize that that could be a significant position, and a lot of people could hold that position. But what they would need to recognize, and I'm not saying, I don't know what your position is, but I'm saying what those people who would hold that position would need to recognize is that if you put this in certain places, it's going to confront certain people. That is, if you put a statue of Robert E. Lee in a community that is going to be visited by African Americans, they can hear the debate about states' rights, but they recognize the reality of what enslavement meant. And they do know that he was fighting to maintain enslavement as one of the things that he wanted to do. So the very act of the monuments was political in itself. And there was a desire to create a certain kind of conversation around them. And so the better way to pursue this, and I think if this was done, you would end up with a totally different perspective towards the monuments themselves, is you can imagine someone saying the Civil War was fought, and after the Civil War, the United States became a state which was more federally directed and run. It became one United States of America. In the context of the United States of America, there was a great degree of effort before the Civil War to justify the marginalization and enslavement of people who were classified as black. Now, many people disagreed with freeing the slaves, and definitely many people disagreed with the equality of black people. And out of that effort came these monuments. And so the real question that lingers is, are people still part of that effort? And my recollection of some of the news reports around people who are protesting around the statues is these are just the questions they're asking. So when someone begins to entertain the possibility of creating a Nazi movement which is inflamed by the protection of these sacred statues, I would wonder if their desire is to maintain peace in the United States of America. Now, the Civil War was fought around this issue. We could fight the Civil War again, and I'm not worried. I don't think all white people are going to go to the let's put them back in slavery side. They might be greatly outnumbered. So I don't think it would be a good idea to provoke this war. And people woke up. And they start saying, why do I have to pass this statue every day? And people begin to complain. And that's what we're really seeing, is people's intolerance for the continued marginalization of the history and representation of groups of people. And it's no coincidence that it is coming with a kind of desire to legitimate the conversation about the place and the space of racism and racial marginalization in American society. I know that's a little off topic, so I hope I didn't get so much off there. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you. The world has so greatly changed with the internet, television, air conditioning, airplanes, and so forth, that to go back to this period, it's really difficult to even understand the period today. So how some of the questions you're asking relate really to the significance of the object to the people, to how they're understanding. How do we convey that to people today when we can't even understand what it's like to be hot all summer? You know,
Yes.
how do we accomplish that in the museum so we really understand what this really meant to the people?
Yes, and this is the job of the museum. This is its task. Yes, and we have to find the creative ways to do this so that it speaks across those spaces. Part of it was just, I gave you a narrative leading up to this object. I talked about the Obas imprisonment, the collection of the items and putting them outside, and they're ultimately finding their way to places like the Penn Museum. How do we tell this story in a way which also allows us to talk about the Benin Kingdom, the Benin people, what their society was like and what their culture was like? That is our job in the museum, is to do that and to leave you, especially a museum like this, because this is not just an art museum. It's a museum of ethnography. We want you to leave with a sense of connection to the other culture, not just journeying through seeing things and being happy or seeing the beauty. The beauty's good. I'm into beauty too. Okay, don't get me wrong. Beauty is good. However, it's important to leave with a little more. It should make us better human beings after experiencing the museum. The public education that we stand to receive and we stand to offer is the real treasure of what we should get from displaying these objects. So we have to figure that out. That is our job. So the how is our job. And one way is to think it through, which is what we're trying to do. And what I'm trying to do with you right now is think it through. Yes, ma'am.
If I understand you, thank you. If I understand you, you see this as as a new trend moving towards something. Can you tell us, in our understanding of material culture? So can you tell us where you see us going, and also sort of tell us about where the Victorian Albert or other museums like the Penn Museum are in this process?
Okay, so the museums are at different places. That's my quick dodge of that question of where they are. So, and some of them, like the V&A, are not talking about giving nothing back to nobody, okay? And they got laws to talk about that, right? And the British Museum, the laws which created the British Museum prohibits it from giving stuff back. Now, they've made exceptions, but when the Greeks came asking for their stuff, they're like, are you crazy? We broke it when we brought it here. We're not gonna break it again, giving it back to you. And, so they create arguments about that. However, when they got into the nitty-gritty about some of the Ethiopian pieces, they said, okay, we can do this. Just like the obelisk in the Axiom obelisk was cut into several pieces. It stands like 80 meters tall. And it was recently returned to Ethiopia, and the UN paid to reconstruct and rebuild it. So where do we end up? We will definitely end up with things like what happened with the Axiom obelisk, right? You'll get pieces that will be reinstalled and reinstated, and that's beautiful because you have so many other cultural treasures and architectural wonders that exist in Axiom, right, in Ethiopia. So definitely there will be this juggling of space, but there has to be a conversation because I don't think anybody is saying we don't need cultural exchange and we don't need to have the stories of other people in the world circulating throughout the world. Part of the problem is it's been one-sided, right? Because who is taking the cultural items from Europe and America and taking them back to Africa? It's happening now because of this conversation. So it seems to me that what I would see the future have, or the future of museums, is there would be increasing circulation of material culture. That even the stuff that belongs or comes from someplace else but was not stolen, I think those items will begin to circulate as well. The ones which were taken by force under colonialism and under enslavement and things like this, they will raise different kinds of questions. And I think those questions have to be answered. But I think ultimately, what it is saying is that there will be more intercommunication. The information, the objects, the material culture will no longer just come from Africa to other parts of the world, but there will need to be more circulation of that information. And definitely that should in itself improve the idea of what it means to be a human being, which I think is something we ultimately have to question. If we put the people back in the equation of the objects, of the material culture, then we're trying to learn about other people. And why are we, at this moment, trying to learn about African people? It's a question we ought to ask ourselves. And what does it mean that we want that information? And do the kids in Africa deserve this information as well? I mean, do the kids in Kenya deserve this information? Do the students in Benin today, the Benin state and the Benin country, do they deserve access to this information? And do they deserve access to something like the U.S. Constitution? Maybe we should do a tour of the U.S. Constitution around Africa. I mean, you know, if you think about the items in the Africa touring around, remember King Tut? Let's do the tour. People all lined up for King Tut. I've said people line up for the U.S. Constitution. So my idea would be that we need more intercommunication. We need more information. I mean, we need to use the internet for sure, but we also need to kind of break down the barrier and the stratification about the material culture and find ways to circulate these things to increase our information one about the other. And in that case, if the people are not there anymore, we still need to tell their stories. As human beings, we owe it to them to tell their story. And because they were wiped out by colonialism or by disease warfare or something like this, doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of that history, especially, in my view, if we will be good and responsible human beings. Okay. Thank you very much.